Hey everybody, this is Carlos Velez with Lacerta Bio in New York, bringing you our 2025 year in review. We're going to start where we always start. That's with the FDA approvals. I say this every year, and I'll say it again. Take a look at the FDA website. You will see the products that have been approved this year. A lot of them don't make the headlines. There's always some interesting products that are there. Lots of products now for rare cancers and other rare diseases and so forth. This year looks like we'll finish at let's call it the 40 approvals for the year. We'll come back to this point in a few minutes. Some of the products that are, I think, are interesting. The first one, Jornavix, a very clever name there, Vertex. It's a non-opioid pain reliever. Thank you very much, Vertex. We need more of that. The next one, Blue Jepa, for uncomplicated urinary tract infections. I don't remember the last time we saw something approved for an uncomplicated infection of any kind, quite frankly. So thank you, GSK. And third one, the very cleverly named Viz by the equally cleverly named Lens Therapeutics, with some old-timey pharmacology there for farsightedness in adults. Very well done. But do check out the list. Some interesting things there. And the 40-ish approvals for the year raised this question: can we in quotes, increase the number of FDA approvals? So the one way to think about this, and one way to look at it, is to look at CDER and CBER employment. Now, it took a sharp dive in 2025, which is a problem. The current administration is in the process of reducing the number of people that work at CBER and CDER. They're also, quote unquote, reviewing PDUFA and BSUFA, which are essentially use taxes, which is a great model when you think about it, because it relieves the burden from the taxpayer. Where this is all headed, it's hard to say. There was let's call it a strongly worded letter sent to the current FDA director about concerns expressed by biotech CEOs about what's happening at the FDA. So where this is all headed, it's hard to say. But to be fair, we as an industry continue to shoot ourselves in the foot when it comes to our filings. It's remarkable how many CRLs are being issued and delays in approval, mainly to CMC related issues of all things. So it's easy to point fingers at the administration, but frankly, we're not doing things as well as we can. There's certainly room for improvement. Now, to be fair, the current administration has been talking about streamlining processes at the FDA, more AI and so forth. That's all great. How all this is going to be executed with fewer people is an interesting question. So where this is all headed, I don't know, but this is certainly a topic that is of interest to all of us. So it's something we should be paying attention to in the year to come. Next topic, China. We could probably spend an hour talking about China. I'm just going to talk about a couple of issues here. China, from a licensing point of view, is this a bubble? Data concerns, and what the implications are for Western-based companies. Now, from a licensing volume and deal value perspective, yeah, there's no question we're seeing more drug candidates being licensed from Chinese companies to companies in the U.S. and Europe. I wouldn't take these numbers literally. Different databases report slightly different numbers, but the volume has certainly been rising, both in terms of the number of transactions and the deal value. A rising deal value is interesting because it implies that these are drug candidates that are perhaps more innovative, have broad potential for multiple phase 2 studies and so forth. But Sightline published some data, which is the graph in the lower left, showing that the number of candidates that are entering the global pipeline that are coming from China, that's also increasing relative to drugs entering the pipeline from the US and others. So lots of stuff coming out of China these days. A lot of that innovation is coming in the form of monoclonal antibodies and monoclonal antibody conjugates. So it's clearly an area of expertise for many of the companies in China. And look, is geography going to be a problem from a licensing point of view and a political point of view? Like, if you're a big pharma company and if your jurisdiction is Ireland, Switzerland, Germany, and so forth, the U.S. administration may huff and puff, but at the end of the day, if it's a good drug candidate, if the data are good, it's going to be licensed, irrespective of where it's coming from. Now, there have been concerns about data integrity from drug candidates coming out of China, and that certainly was a problem, a decade ago. But it's certainly much better now. That doesn't mean that it's a problem that's gone away. And look, this is why they call it due diligence, right? You have to look at the data very carefully, irrespective of where it comes from. And part of the reason why the data integrity problem is less of an issue these days is simply because this is an important industry for the Chinese government. So as long as the Chinese government is leaning into this, the government will do everything it can to make sure that innovation in China is monetized in some way, primarily through licensing. But the other thing that's been happening in China are the concept of sea turtles. Sea turtles are basically U.S., EU trained scientists. These are people that come to the U.S., for example. They get their degrees here, they work for companies in the U.S., and then they return to China to start companies. And this was detailed in a really interesting podcast, the Cures for Capital podcast, that was recorded in June. So do check it out if you want to learn more about this topic. And look, it's pretty simple. A biotech CEO in Boston is going to cost you twice as much as a biotech CEO in Guangzhou or in Beijing. So, China is just in this unique position to generate a lot of innovation with very well-trained scientists. Many of these companies have quite a bit of capital, and they're just able to do it very, very well. However, this is an extremely interesting study or an article written by Sebastian Gensior. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do check it out. It's on his website, p05.org, where he looks at a lot of the numbers coming out of China. He notes that, for example, phase 1 and phase 2 success rates are falling for clinical trials conducted in China. Some of these trials may not represent global patient populations. The active comparator may be not relevant in terms of Western standard of care. And there's frankly a lot of therapeutic area concentration in companies that are developing drug candidates, companies in China rather. So, there are some issues here when it comes to drug candidates coming out of China. So what does this all mean? We may be in a situation, I don't know if you want to call this a bubble, but we may be in a situation where right now, 2025, 2026, there may be a unique window of opportunity to in-license very sophisticated, high-quality candidates backed by clinical data. Are there risks? Yeah, absolutely. Deeper diligence may be required. There may be a need for bridging studies. So maybe a quote-unquote phase 2 drug candidate may be valued as phase 1 because some bridging studies may be needed. Regardless, this is a situation where if you're sitting in the US or Europe, you are now competing against a lot of these very innovative drug candidates coming out of China. So it just increases the difficulty in finding one of those licenses with a big pharma company. Next, artificial intelligence. Speaking of bubbles, certainly we have seen the number of investments going into healthcare-related artificial intelligence companies fall since the bubble years of 2020 and 2021. We're seeing more cash going into fewer companies. But whether this is a bubble is probably the wrong question. And, if you're interested in this topic, do check out an article that was written, actually a very lengthy article that's written by Luis Pereiras, who is a venture capitalist at In Vivo Partners in Barcelona. It's just an excellent article. You see the link there. The reality is that artificial intelligence is being used across the entire value chain in our industry, and a lot of these use cases you frankly don't hear about them. They're not very sexy. They're somewhat mundane, but yet this is what's really increasing the speed and efficiency when it comes to not only drug development but also commercialization. So this is great, even though we may not hear about it. And look, ultimately, artificial intelligence depends on the training data and what you're doing with the training data. So if you have extensive training data in, manufacturing, and you're trying to do something that's incremental, then AI can work extremely well. If you're doing something that's very, very novel, like discover a completely new chemical entity, then it becomes a bit more difficult. So artificial intelligence, it's here to say, it's here to stay. It's being deployed broadly across the value chain, and you know, do check out this article by McKinsey, where they talk about this in a little bit more detail. So while there may be a lot of hype bubbles around R&D, AI is really making inroads across the entire value chain in our industry. So that's essentially the reality. I'm going to contradict myself a little bit and say that there is possibly a bubble when it comes to artificial intelligence and investments more broadly. I do recommend a discussion between the economist Paul Krugman and Paul Kudrowski that was recorded quite recently, where they talk about real estate in AI, power supply, costs, and so forth. It's a really broad-ranging discussion if you want to learn more about artificial intelligence and more broadly. Next, show me the money. Show me the money. Licensing trends. Yeah, the number of licenses and related transactions will be down for 2025. That's not a surprise. That's something that most of us expected. We're roughly at 40% ish of those licenses involving preclinical drug candidates, which is very consistent with historical norms. Preclinical licenses are roughly 35 to 50% of all licenses, so that's certainly very consistent with historical norms. In terms of venture capital deployment, we are at an interesting point. So we'll probably end the year at a nearly record high in terms of the amount of cash deployed by VCs into biotechs. Now, this is probably what we're probably seeing here is more cash into fewer companies, which is a challenge. But if you look at it from a deployment point of view, I think 2025 is a really good year. Now, the reason for that is because if you look at the graph at the lower left, VCs raised a lot of cash in 2020, 2021, and 2022. And so a lot of that capital is being deployed in 2023, 2024, and 2025. Now, what's a bit worrying is this number here, 9. 9 is the amount of capital that SVB projects will be raised by VCs, GPs in 2025. And as you can see from the graph, that's a really, really low number. Now, that's a problem because that means that the amount of cash that will be deployed in 2026, 2027 is going to be much, much lower than it has been recently. So, this is a problem. Chances are we're going to see much less venture capital available in our industry in the next couple of years. And cell and gene therapy is probably going to be one of the victims of this, which is unfortunate because these are modalities that are achieving just amazing clinical results that frankly can't be achieved any other way. But as we all know, there are problems. There are tox issues, there are cost issues, and so forth. Again, Luis Pereiras has another very good article. This one talking about cell and gene therapy from the investor point of view. Lots of companies have struggled. I think most of you are familiar with the story behind Bluebird Bio. BioMarin has had issues. These companies on the left have dropped out of cell and gene therapy entirely. Now, obviously, they can jump back in. But this is going to be an area where the technical issues combined with the lack of capital is just going to make it a challenge for a lot of companies in the space. The IPO market, well, it's frankly, on the one hand, it's non-existent, but on the other hand, the IPO market has pretty much returned to pre-bubble sort of historical levels. This year will probably end, I don't know, the 4-ish billion range, which is low. It's definitely low. We are seeing fewer and fewer listed companies. Many of these are just companies are simply disappearing. They're delisting. Some have called this a cleansing of the public markets. Given what happened during the bubble years, I'm not a big fan of that term, but there it is. But paradoxically, the XBI, the biotech index, has been rising since April. Now we're nowhere near the February 2020 high, but there is some recovery. Why is that? I suspect a number of factors here. I suspect the big one is just simply the anticipation of M&A events. We may be seeing some tourist investors returning, so investors that are pivoting away from AI may be coming back into biotech. some of the tariffs that were announced earlier this year, perhaps less severe, less impactful. Um, lots of talk about price controls and lowering prices and, reshoring manufacturing and so forth. We'll come back to that point in a few minutes. Look, at the end of the day, we're a science-driven industry. And so, our ability as an industry to, generate very interesting data, create very interesting products based on science, it's just simply going to be attractive from an investment point of view. So, whether or not that trend will continue, we'll simply have to see. And, look, the LOE storm, the loss of exclusivity storm that we have been talking about for a number of years now, it's finally here. It's arrived. It's amazing to see some of the, the products that are going to be coming off patent soon. So this may also be driving the growth in the XBI. And so, I think it's safe to say we'll probably see a lot more transactions in 2026, especially for very late stage drug candidates. But that also means that a lot of these listed companies are frankly sitting on perhaps interesting drug candidates. They may be sitting on balance sheets that are less than ideal. So it may be actually a good buying opportunity for progressive investors, those that are looking to apply sort of a slightly different model. So maybe it's creating new newcos, venture studio investments, and so forth. So it actually may be a good buying opportunity if some of these listed companies that are struggling have interesting drug candidates. So, what does this all mean? I have no idea. It makes drawing sort of extensive conclusions somewhat difficult. But I think it's very fair to say that capital is being deployed, because that was capital that was raised 2-3 years ago. But moving forward, I think it's going to be very challenging. I think there's going to be a lot less venture capital available. Licensing will probably remain stable. The most interesting investment opportunities may come from some of these companies that are struggling, that are sitting on some potentially interesting drug candidates. Next, how do we address this topic? Obviously, there's a lot to say. One of the things that is in that SVB report that I mentioned earlier is these data. Now, many of you may be aware that there's been quite a bit of NIH funding that's been canceled. But what is also in that report, which I found startling, is the number of US-based academics that are seeking research positions outside the US. So now what we're seeing is a reduction not only in cash available to conduct research, but also we're experiencing a brain drain. How this is making America great again, I'm not entirely sure. Now, I'll give the administration a little bit of credit here, in that they are making noise regarding this drug pricing imbalance that we're experiencing between the US and the rest of the world. It's a problem. How we solve this problem, I haven't a clue. We're talking about the largest market being essentially private pay versus public pay. How we address this, I simply do not have a clue. I think this is a problem that's just going to persist for many, many years. There is talk about, reshoring a lot of manufacturing. We in the U.S. import a lot of branded medicine, for, perhaps some good reasons. It's no accident that some of these drugs are coming from countries like Ireland and Switzerland. Look, CEOs are talking about building facilities and building plants and reshoring. Call me somewhat cynical. I frankly don't believe a lot of that. Mainly because it just takes years, to construct a biomanufacturing facility, to validate it, and so forth. Quite frankly, if I'm a CEO, do I want to spend that money to build a facility to make a product that I'm already having made in someplace else, or would I use that cash to actually buy a company or in-license some drug candidates? I know what I would do, but we'll see how that all shakes out. And look, it really doesn't help to have an anti-vaxxer in charge of Health and Human Services. So, yeah, it's not a great time for things coming out of Washington, D.C. So let's close with some parting shots. Look, pharma has to buy. There's a wave of M&A coming. It's already started. I think that's just going to continue. Interesting trend that we're seeing in terms of direct-to-consumer delivery of prescription medications, moving beyond hair loss and other categories. We're seeing it in obesity. We're seeing it with generics. Look, if Amazon is involved, there's money to be made. So I wouldn't be terribly surprised if we start seeing more and more of this next year and the years to come. I'm just amazed at the sheer complexity of some of the molecules that we're discovering and developing and commercializing. So I think that's great. I think it, obviously it's more complicated, it's more difficult, but you get the feeling that we're living in the future when it comes to some of the molecules that we're discovering and developing. Speaking of living in the future, aging. When I first started hearing about companies developing quote unquote drugs to quote unquote treat aging, I thought it was a bit of a fad, a meme, call it what you will. But yeah, there seems to be a lot of money going to aging. Seems to be a lot of money going to longevity. I suspect a lot of money is coming from, non-traditional biotech VCs. Whether that continues or not, I don't know. Whether big pharma gets involved in some of these areas, it's an interesting question. We've had some, frankly, some spectacular clinical failures this year. I'm of the view that when something fails in the clinic, I think that's a cause for celebration. I think that's a time we thank the company for taking the risk. Just like a funeral in New Orleans, we should be celebrating failure, not criticizing those who take the shot. So that's our review for the year. In terms of our activity this year, we did a lot of writing this year. Had some good discussions with Alex Wang talking about China. Published a couple of articles on CMC with our good friend Natalie Huther, and the TAM sham. Yes, if you have TAM in your presentation, take it out, read the article. Also wrote quite a bit with my good friend Remco Foppen about artificial intelligence. Those were published in Life Science Leader, Drug Target Review, and European Pharmaceutical Review. If you're interested in any of this, send me an email. I was happy to send you links to those articles. And we published a book this year, Partnering for Growth. It is a very broad, not terribly deep overview of business development and licensing. So the book talks about in and out licensing, term sheets and contracts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You see the link there if you do want to learn more about it. I do want to thank everybody who stopped by the Biocom booth at Bio Europe this year for the book signing. That was a lot of fun signing books for folks. So thank all of you for stopping by. And if you don't know about us, Lacerta Bio, we were founded in 2010. We focus on in and out licensing, business development and licensing strategies and tactics. And we also run a couple of training programs, both live and online. We also do custom training for companies who are interested in expanding their BD teams and expanding their BD skills. So if you're interested in any of these services, ping us. And that's it. That is 2025. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks for interacting with us this year. And para mis amigos que hablan castellano, les deseo unas felices fiestas, una feliz Navidad y un próspero y seguro año 2026. Thanks, everybody. Take care.